Aristotle's Whatness and Thisness. I wonder what kind of strangeness is getting ready to come your way. Okay, so remember, Aristotle does not accept Plato's dual conception of reality, where forms exist in some non-material, intelligible realm, and then matter exists here in the physical world. So he does not accept Plato's idea that the form of cat exists non-materially, and then here in the physical world are little representations of cats with their particular fur and toenails and feet, etc. Instead, what Aristotle says is that you can't separate form from matter and be having any kind of meaningful conversation of reality. Form and matter are embedded together. They're inextricably intertwined together. And what Aristotle means by that is this. He means that form is kind of what something is. It's the nature of the material in the way that it's been assembled. It's the essence of the thing. So somebody says to you, "What are you holding in your hand?" And you say, "It's a knife." It's not the idea of a knife. It's a knife. And what Aristotle says is that's what it is. You can look at it and you can see the way that the material has been shaped and see that that gives this thing a particular function. And it's different from the function of very similar material that's been given a very different form. Okay? So a rain gutter is maybe made of the same matter, same material as the knife, but it has a totally different form. And that form makes it good for keeping rain away from your house, but lousy for cutting steaks. And then the reverse would be true perhaps for this knife. So the form is the whatness of a thing. It's a knife. It's a rain gutter. It's an ink pen. That's the whatness of this thing. But the thisness is the matter, right? The thisness is the unique properties of that individual thing. So Aristotle would say, hey, look, this knife and this rain gutter, they may have the same material, but they have different forms. You could even bring into the picture a knife that looks to be identical to the first knife, or a piece of rain gutter that looks to be identical to that first rain gutter. And Aristotle would say that even though those two knives share the same form, they don't share the same properties. In other words, he would say this knife is not this knife. They're two separate knives. You might think about it this way. I have two pens in my hand. That's what these are. They both have the same form. They're pen with little yellow things on the top. But this is this pen, and this is this pen. This pen is not this pen, right? They're the same thing. They have the same form, but they're not made of the same properties. This, even though it appears to be identical, has its own unique properties that allow me to put it over here while still holding this one in my hand. And that's what Aristotle is saying about whatness and thisness. Whatness is the form. Thisness is the particular properties that each one of those embodied things possess. Okay, so for Aristotle, you take form, you take matter, and now you have a thing. Okay, so I take this pen, I have a thing in my hand. I have a thing because I can recognize this is distinct from all the other things that this is not in the world. Okay, this is not the same thing as this computer board. These are different things. So I asked you in your thought primer, what's a thing? And Aristotle would say, well, a thing is when you have some matter that's been brought together into a particular form. Then it becomes a thing. When it's just sort of out there, indistinguishable from all the other things, it's not really a thing. It's just sort of out there, formless. And it won't be a thing until it's been given some sort of form, or some sort of form is imposed on it. Now, that form may be imposed on it intellectually. Right? So in other words, I may say, oh, I see this random collection of stuff. I can start to categorize it, and now all of a sudden I've got things. Okay? Or I can impose a physical form on it. So one of the implications of this for Aristotle is that reality is not dual in nature, like Plato claimed. Instead, reality is plural. There is a seemingly infinite number of things in the universe. Okay? There's a seemingly infinite number of matter that have taken on particular forms, and each one of those particular collections of matter that have been taken on forms is a thing. It's a thing that constitutes reality. So for Aristotle, reality is plural in its nature. And what's important for Aristotle is you can't really separate form and matter in any way except sort of as an intellectual exercise, as a kind of thought experiment. So he might say something like, in reality there exists this bronze sphere. And I recognize that this thing has different properties. It has the property of sphericity, right? The property of being round. And it also has this bronze stuff that's made of, and these things come together, and I have this bronze sphere. But Aristotle would say, like, well, you can't really take the bronze stuff out of this bronze sphere and still have the sphere. You can only do that kind of in your mind. It would be like if I asked you, picture a basketball, hold a basketball in your hand, and you recognize that basketball has certain properties. It has the property of rubber. It has the property of roundness. And if I said to you, like, okay, now I want you to take away the property of rubber. And you'd say, if you take away the property of rubber, I no longer have the basketball. And Aristotle's like, yeah, exactly. Same thing if I asked you to take away the property of sphericity or roundness from that basketball. And you say, well, if I took away the property of roundness from the basketball, it would no longer be a basketball. And Aristotle says, exactly. That's why form and matter can't be separated from one another in any way except sort of intellectually. And this was important for Aristotle's epistemology. Okay, so all of this sort of metaphysical worldview that Aristotle's laid out here is going to have implications for how he believes you can attain knowledge of this reality. So our first principle is for Aristotle is he agrees with Plato. Yes, you can attain knowledge of reality. Reality is possible. But unlike Plato, Aristotle says reason alone isn't going to get us there. Reason alone is, we can't think our way to reality. We have to experience reality and think about our experience. All knowledge begins with experience, says Aristotle. And importantly, because we can walk around the world and experience things, and think about those things and talk about those things we have experiences of in the material world, Aristotle concludes that there must be some affinity in the structure of our minds and in the structure of the material world outside of ourselves. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to sort of have any kind of relationship with one another. Now, these two thoughts right here, all knowledge begins with experience, and language, thought, and reality kind of fit together and must have some sort of the same structure. Aristotle's coming up with these ideas 340 BC, sometime around there. And we're going to see that these two ideas will come back 2,000 years later and give us a really good starting point for modern epistemology and thinking about the relationship between language, thought, and reality. For Aristotle, to acquire knowledge about this reality requires that we go out and we have experience of particular things. Okay, so I'm going to gain knowledge about ink pens by having an experience of ink pens. And I'm going to gain knowledge of different ink pens and understanding how they're different by cataloging their different properties or their different forms. So this was super important for Aristotle. For Aristotle, to acquire knowledge requires that we be able to categorize things, that we be able to recognize how some matter, some material, is different from other material, and how some collections of material are different forms from other types of things. This is, for Aristotle, an essential feature of acquiring knowledge. If we're going to understand the natural world, we have to be able to recognize what makes things in the natural world different from one another. What can we lump into the same category? And what would be the basis for determining that these things are the same? So I could take these two pens, and even though they don't share the same property of color, we recognize, well, these belong in the pen bin. But if we were going to catalog further and say, no, those don't belong in the same pen bin because I'm only looking to put pens in the red pen bin. And we say, oh, well, these two go in there, but this one's going to have to go in the blue pen bin. So this is how we acquire knowledge according to Aristotle. It's very sort of intuitive, very common sense. You go out into the world, you have an experience of things, you catalog the different properties and different forms that these things you're having in your experience, and then you look to see, how do these things interact? How do these things share properties? How do these things differ? And if we do this, we're going to gain knowledge of reality.